greed, guilt, and gunshots. Those are the 3 reasons why Dakota Gray is going to be forced to grow up without a father. Why Taylor Gray is no longer with us. And why Blake Gray is on trial today. Members of the jury, we the state have the burden in this case. It is our burden to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt these 3 elements: that Taylor Gray is dead, that the death was caused by the criminal act of Blake Gray, and that there was a premeditated killing of Taylor Gray. We've met this burden today, members of the jury. You've heard it and you've seen it. We've given you everything you need to just use your common sense and reason to go into that jury room, deliberate, and fill out that verdict form with the only verdict that makes sense: that Blake Gray is guilty of first-degree murder. I know it's been a long day, members of the jury. You've heard a lot of really complicated testimony, and you've seen and heard some things that were difficult to see and hear, things that were gruesome and brutal. But you have an important responsibility today, and so do we. We have to ensure that justice is done and that murderers don't walk away free. So we're going to talk again one more time about everything that you heard here today. Members of the jury, I want to remind you what you heard from Detective Lewis. Detective Lewis was tendered as an expert in ballistics and firearms. He has extensive experience with shotguns, weapons deployment, and weapons safety. What Detective Lewis told you is that when he arrived on the scene, they came into that home and Blake Gray was covered in blood. When they cleared the house and they got to that bedroom, that room where Taylor Gray was lying dead, Detective Lewis could immediately tell a shotgun had been used. Detective Lewis also told you that in the 250 homicide cases he has worked, he can't remember a single time that someone has been able to sleep through a gunshot going off in the same room. But that's exactly what the defendant Blake Gray wants you to believe. It just doesn't make sense. The defense wants to point the finger at someone else. They want to bring up this supposed vengeful ex. The members of the jury, Detective Lewis told you, right after he questioned Blake Gray and her brother, he went to the home of Devin Gray. He spoke to Devin and her new boyfriend. They were both in bed asleep, and there was no evidence that they had been involved in any way. They followed that lead. But there was nothing to do because they already knew who the murderer was. There was ample evidence at that crime scene that Blake Gray was the one who pulled that trigger. And they eventually did find a shotgun. They found a 12-gauge shotgun in a storage unit that belonged to the defendant, Blake Gray. They also performed a gunshot residue test on Blake Gray. And you heard from Detective Lewis when he explained to you that an inconclusive result doesn't mean that person didn't pull the trigger. It means they could have washed their hands. They could have even wiped the residue off. And he also explained to you that when a gun that has a long barrel, like a shotgun, is used, that residue is further away from the hands, so it's less likely to be there. It makes sense that that test was inconclusive. Another thing Detective Lewis explained to all of you members of the jury was some of the technical factors related to decibel ratings. Now, just hearing that someone slept through a shotgun blast doesn't really sound believable, but We wanted to make sure you had all the facts you needed to make a rational and reasonable determination of what happened in this case. So Detective Lewis explained to you, a gunshot, especially from a shotgun in a closed room, would be about 140 decibels on this OSHA chart. That's the same as a jet engine taking off, inches from someone's head. Things like a bulldozer, a wood shop, and a chainsaw are all quieter than that shotgun was when it went off in that room. But the defendant wants you to believe she didn't jump out of bed. She wasn't startled awake by that noise that was so loud it should have been painful. She didn't jump out of bed when her husband's brain matter splattered across her face. She heard a funny noise. And then her story changes. She either turned on the light to discover that he was deceased, or she tried to shake him awake, and that's how she discovered he was deceased. That story changed because that's not what happened. What happened is Blake Gray made the premeditated decision to murder her husband. She went and she got that shotgun. She walked into their bedroom, she pointed it at the back of his head, and she pulled that trigger. Members of the jury, you heard from a lot of experts today. Another expert you heard from was the state's expert, Dr. Avery. Dr. Avery is the chief medical examiner for our county. Dr. Avery explained to you, and Detective Lewis backed up the fact that they secured that crime scene. She was very meticulous in the way she went through the evidence at the crime scene, and nobody touched the body until she got there. And when she examined that crime scene, she was thorough and she was detailed, and it was her expert opinion that Blake Gray was the one who caused that death. Dr. Avery told you that based on evidence, primarily the fact that Blake Gray's sweatshirt she was wearing that was covered in blood was also covered in what is called back spatter. Back spatter is what comes out of an entrance wound, not an exit wound. The different type and shape of those droplets and the brain matter on that sweatshirt show that Blake Gray was not on the exit wound side of her husband. There was no way she was laying in this bed. She was standing over him, and her body, where that blood hit her, came out of the entrance wound because she pulled that trigger. Now, you also heard from the defense's expert, Dr. Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy even told you himself that Dr. Avery is incredibly detailed, and he has a lot of professional respect for her. And I'm sure Dr. Kennedy is a fine doctor, but he was also paid for his appearance today. You heard he was paid $750 to talk to all of you today. And you also saw his CV, where he lists that he'll also help with case strategy. Now, what they're doing is the defense is trying to use Dr. Kennedy to help them make the evidence fit the defendant's theory, but it doesn't. The evidence isn't going to lie to you. The evidence is going to show you what happened. And this evidence shows you that Blake Gray murdered her husband. The defendant stood up here herself and she told you. She told you within a couple breaths 2 different stories about how she discovered her husband was dead. She told you that she was $400,000 in debt. And she told you that she'd been going IVF treatments, a process that can be very emotionally taxing. She told you she in fact decided to go through another round just 1 week before her husband's murder. She also talked to you about this insurance policy, the same insurance policy Detective Lewis told you about. Now, this insurance policy has a couple stipulations. One of them is that the person who causes the death cannot collect. So if Blake Gray was found to have murdered Taylor Gray, she wouldn't be able to collect this money. Blake Gray wants you to believe that she was simply too distraught to collect this money. She just couldn't bring herself to fulfill this policy. But what she could bring herself to do was start going on dates just 3 months after her husband died inches from her. Blake Gray is in fact remarried right now, which is another one of these stipulations that even if the beneficiary remarries, they can still collect this policy. You even heard me ask Blake Gray some questions about her IVF treatments and if her husband was even aware she was undergoing these attempts to get pregnant, because her husband already had a child, a much older child. Members of the jury, you heard her, in her own words, tell you that she didn't see anybody run out of that room. She didn't jump out of bed when that gunshot went off. She simply wanted to point the finger at somebody else without giving any kind of reasonable explanation of what happened that night. Members of the jury, we have just 3 elements we have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt. The state's burden today is to prove these 3 things. The first, Taylor Gray is dead. I don't think there's any question there. You heard from the medical examiner. You saw the autopsy report. You can see, sadly, in these crime scene photos right behind me, that Taylor Gray is in fact dead. We've met this element. The second element, the death was caused by the criminal act of Blake Gray. Members of the jury, you heard from Dr. Avery, a chief medical examiner with decades of experience who was certified in front of you as an expert, that these blood spatter and brain matter marks are back spatter on Blake Gray's sweatshirt, and that this back spatter would only have come from the entrance wound. And for this to have occurred, Blake Gray would have had to have been standing over Taylor when that trigger was pulled. Additionally, the best argument the defense was able to put forward with their expert, an expert who is not qualified to examine blood spatter but only cause a manner of death, is a void pattern. The void pattern they're claiming is this area of sheets that are white where there's no blood. But if you look at these photos of where Devin's body and these blankets are, you can see that there's easily a barrier that would block the blood spray from hitting the bed, from hitting Taylor's body and those blankets. Additionally, in Exhibit G, you can see quite plainly there's an indentation in the pillow where someone's head was laying at some point, and there's a huge pool of blood right there. There's no way this blood could be here if Blake Gray's head was here, as she claims. The way this blood and brain matter got under Blake Gray's armpit of that sweatshirt is because she was standing over her husband with her body turned when she pulled that trigger, and that spray went up this way. That would not be physically possible if she were laying in bed. Members of the jury, we have met the second element. These crime scene photos, the testimony of our witnesses, and your reason and common sense clearly prove that this death was caused by a criminal act of Blake Gray. And finally, members of the jury, this third element, there was a premeditated killing of Taylor Gray. Members of the jury, premeditation isn't something that takes weeks or months. It can be formed in the mind in an instant. Someone who kills somebody with a gun has to go get that weapon, pick it up, aim it, and pull that trigger. Those are multiple steps that take a lot of thought and reasoning. We have proved that this killing was premeditated simply by the fact that a shotgun was used intentionally. Additionally, if there was any question about using the gun itself being premeditation, we've also shown you this insurance policy, and you've heard the testimony about Blake Gray's debt. She had plenty of motive. Members of the jury, this third element has also been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, members of the jury, when you go back to that room to deliberate, I want you to remember 1, 2, 3. Greed, gunshot, guilt. Blake Gray is guilty of murder in the first degree. Thank you.